Before today's video starts, we just want to note that today's video is a continuation of our last video, 3 murders committed by Henry Lee Lucas. If you have not already watched that video, we suggest you go back and watch it because it will provide a lot of background for this video. A link to that video can be found in the description box below this video. Thank you, and without further delay, here's today's video. Number 3. Clemmie Curtis. After Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in June 1983 and confessed to the murders of Becky Powell and Kate Rich, he began to confess to dozens of other murders. In the first month after he was arrested, he claimed he had killed over 100 people in 17 states. Henry said that he committed some of these murders with his good friend, Otis Toole. In the fall of 1984, Henry told investigators that he remembered killing a police officer with Otis near Huntington, West Virginia. So investigators from West Virginia traveled to Georgetown, Texas, where Henry was being held. Henry explained that sometime in 1975 or 1976, he and Otis were traveling around in a car and they ended up in Huntington. They did some break-ins and committed some robberies, but they were out of money. They got some beer and decided to hide out in a lover's lane so they could drink in peace. But not long after they parked, a police officer pulled up behind them. Henry said that the officer saw the stolen items in the car and he was going to arrest them. The officer got back into his car and he went to use the radio. Henry claimed that he and Otis moved quickly and got into the front seat of the police car on either side of the officer. They managed to get the officer's gun away from him. Henry said that they let the police officer write a note to say goodbye to his family. After he finished writing the note, Henry said he shot the officer with the officer's own gun. The Huntington Police Department had a victim that matched the description of the murder that Henry described. On August 3, 1976, 30-year-old Huntington police officer Clemmie Curtis was found dead in his police car that was parked in a lover's lane just outside of Huntington. His wrists were handcuffed in front of him with his own handcuffs. He had been shot once in the chest with his own service revolver. Beside him, there was a note that read, "I think he's gonna kill me." Henry was taken to Huntington and he led investigators to the area where Curtis was shot. On January 22, 1985, Henry Lee Lucas pleaded guilty to the murder of Clemmie Curtis and he was sentenced to life in prison. Henry had already been given 4 life sentences, a 75-year sentence, and a death sentence. In April 1984, Otis Toole had been convicted of the January 1982 murder of 64-year-old George Sonnenberg. Sonnenberg was killed when someone locked him in his home in Jacksonville, Florida, and then the house was set on fire. Otis was not charged with the murder of Clemmie Curtis because no physical evidence connected him to the killing. No physical evidence connected Henry to the murder either. The only evidence against him was his confession. However, even at the time of the conviction, people noticed significant problems with Henry's confession. Notably, there had been 2 investigations into the death of Clemmie Curtis. One was conducted in 1976 at the time of Curtis's death, and the other one happened 6 years later. Both investigations concluded the same thing. Curtis had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun was found on his lap, and there were gunshot powder burns on his shirt that were consistent with someone shooting themselves in the chest. Another major problem is that there is no evidence that Henry was in West Virginia when Curtis was killed. But there is evidence that Henry was 475 miles away from Curtis when he was shot. In August 1976, Henry was living with his wife and her children in a trailer park in Port Deposit, Maryland. It turned out that the police from West Virginia never investigated where Henry might have been when Curtis was shot. In 1986, over a year after Henry pleaded guilty to the murder of Clemmie Curtis, a private detective was investigating Henry's confessions. The private detective traveled to Port Deposit, Maryland, and he interviewed the manager of the trailer park where Henry lived with his wife and her children. He was surprised to learn that he was the first investigator to talk to the manager about Henry Lee Lucas. The manager showed the private detective a record that indicated that Henry had paid the rent on the same day that Curtis was killed. The private detective also found evidence that 2 days after Curtis's death, Henry was shopping with his wife and her children for back-to-school clothes in Oxford, Pennsylvania, which is about 17 miles from Port Deposit. Another major problem with Henry's confession is that he said that he and Otis killed the police officer together. But Curtis was killed in August 1976, and there is absolutely no evidence that Henry and Otis knew each other before February 1979. Finally, Henry Lee Lucas had a history of helping law enforcement. An excellent example of this is the murder of Betty Thornton in Little Rock, Arkansas on November 6, 1981. Thornton was shot 3 times while working in a convenience store. A man came into the store around the time of the murder, and he remembered paying a young man who was standing behind the counter. Since Thornton was the only person working that day, the police concluded that the man actually paid the killer. The man was shown a photo lineup, and he picked out 20-year-old Scotty Scott as the man he saw behind the counter. He said that he was 99% sure that was Scott. 2 other eyewitnesses also placed Scott at the crime scene around the time of the murder. Scott was the son of a retired state trooper. Scott admitted that he was outside the store around the time of the murder, but he claimed he only used the payphone and he did not kill Thornton. Nevertheless, Scott was charged with murder and he went to trial in 1982. That trial ended in a hung jury. He went to trial again in May 1983. He was convicted of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to 25 years of prison. Then, in the spring of 1984, about a year into Scott's sentence, Henry confessed to the murder of Betty Thornton. Because of Henry's confession, in August 1984, Scott's conviction was overturned. After the conviction was overturned, the police investigated Henry's confession regarding the murder of Thornton. They learned that on the day of the murder, Henry was in Jacksonville, Florida. On that day, Henry had purchased a car and got insurance for the car. The police saw the dated paperwork Henry had signed to both buy the car and get insurance for it. Little Rock is over 870 miles from Jacksonville, so Henry could not have killed Betty Thornton. Henry was asked how he knew about the details of the murder if he wasn't involved. He said that the information had been given to him. He had been asked to help out Scotty Scott by a friend of Scott's father. Scotty Scott went to trial for a 3rd time in May 1989, nearly 5 years after his conviction was overturned. This time, he was acquitted. People point out that Henry's false confession directly helped Scotty Scott, the son of a state trooper, get away with murder. In the case of police officer Clemmie Curtis, when Lucas was convicted of his murder, the ruling on Curtis's death certificate was changed from suicide to homicide. As a result, Curtis's widow was given $1 million payout from a life insurance policy that had previously been withheld because Curtis's death had been ruled as suicide. For all these reasons, many people do not think that Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole killed Clemmie Curtis. Number 2. Dianna Bryant. In the spring of 1981, Dianna Bryant was 17 years old and she was a junior at her high school. She lived in Brownfield, Texas, which had a population of just over 10,000 people. On the night of April 26, 1981, Dianna was babysitting 2 children in an apartment in Brownfield. When the children's mother returned home from work at about 1 a.m., she found Dianna dead in one of the bedrooms. The woman immediately checked on her children and found them sleeping peacefully in the other bedroom. She then called 911. Dianna had been strangled from behind with an electrical cord from a vacuum cleaner. The cord was still wrapped around her neck. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. When the police arrived at the apartment, the TV was still on. Nothing had been stolen from the apartment. Dianna was fully clothed and there were no signs of sexual assault. There were signs of a struggle in the bedroom where Dianna was killed. But that was the only room that was out of sorts. The police investigated the murder, but they couldn't figure out who would want to kill Dianna Bryant. So eventually, the case went cold. Then in June 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was arrested on the firearm violation. A year later, Henry was being interviewed by a reporter from a TV station in East Texas. Henry mentioned that he remembered strangling a young woman to death with an electrical cord. The police investigated the comment, and they thought that Henry may have been talking about the murder of Dianna Bryant. Henry was then brought to Brownfield. According to the investigators, they purposely took him to the wrong apartment that was on a different street. They claimed that Henry said that it was the wrong building. Henry then apparently directed the investigators to the correct building. However, Henry was not able to identify the specific apartment. After supposedly identifying the building where Dianna had been killed, Henry and the investigators went back to the police station. Henry then confessed to the murder of Dianna Bryant. He said that he had been traveling with Otis Toole, Becky Powell, and Becky's brother, Frank. Henry said that they stopped off at a barbecue restaurant that was kitty corner from the apartment where Dianna was babysitting. At the restaurant, they had some coffee and they discussed robbing a home. They decided to rob one of the apartments that was kitty corner to the restaurant. Henry said that they went directly from the restaurant to the apartment building. He said that he and Becky went to a random door and knocked on it. A teenage girl answered the door, and Henry told her that they were hungry and they needed food. So the young woman let them into the apartment and she made them some food. A few minutes later, Oz and Frank let themselves into the apartment. Henry said that this made the girl nervous, but she still made food for Otis and Frank. Henry said that he and Otis were sitting on the couch in the living room eating their food, and the young woman was in the kitchen with Frank and Becky. He told Otis that they couldn't leave a witness behind. Henry said that he went looking for a weapon to dispose of the young woman. He looked in a closet and he found the vacuum cleaner. Using a butcher knife that he carried with him, he cut the cord off the vacuum cleaner. He said he walked up behind the young woman who was still in the kitchen talking to Frank and Becky, and he started to strangle her with the cord. Henry said that the young woman started to back away from him, so he wrestled her to the kitchen floor and strangled her to death there. Afterward, he claimed he had sex with the body and then redressed her. Henry then said that they rifled through the apartment. He claimed that Becky and Frank both stole something, but Henry didn't know what they took. Then they all piled into their car and left town. Henry told the investigators that the murder happened sometime between 10:30 and 11:30 p.m. After Henry confessed, he was charged with the murder of Dianna Bryant. On September 22, 1984, in accordance with a plea agreement, Henry pleaded guilty and he was sentenced to 75 years of prison. Then in April 1986, the newspaper, the Dallas Times-Herald, published an article by reporters Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Henderson. The article was the result of a 15-month investigation into Henry Lee Lucas's confessions. Ainsworth had conducted extensive interviews with Lucas while he was in jail. He had also been in the room when Henry confessed to several crimes. But when Ainsworth was alone with Henry, Henry had told him that he had only killed 3 people. The article he authored with Henderson argued that there was no way Henry Lee Lucas murdered as many people as he claimed to have killed. In the media, Henry had been painted as a sociopathic drifter who would kill anyone who crossed his path. The truth is that Henry was not much of a drifter. After he was paroled in 1975, when his murder spree supposedly started, he was living in Port Deposit, Maryland, with his wife and her children. During that time, he was on parole, and he regularly met with his parole officer. Then, when he left his wife in late 1978, he drifted for a couple of months. In early 1979, Henry was in Jacksonville, Florida, where he lived for the next 2 years. Then Henry and Becky traveled to California before going to Texas to live with Kate Ridge. So while Henry did a bit of drifting, friends and family of Henry said that he was rarely gone for more than a few days. So people were usually able to give him an alibi for murders that were committed hundreds of miles away. Also, it would have been logistically impossible for Henry to have committed all the murders. For example, to commit all the murders he said he committed between October 2nd and November 2nd, 1978, he would have had to drive 10,000 miles. But his wife said that he was at home in Port Deposit during that month. His parole officer also talked to him that month. Henry also said he committed a lot of murders with Otis Toole. However, the reporters were able to find alibis for Otis on many of the days that he supposedly committed the murders with Henry. The Dallas Times-Herald article led to an investigation by the Texas Attorney General's office. In November 1986, the Attorney General, Jim Maddox, released a scathing 60-page document called the Lucas Report. The report had the same conclusion as the article. Henry Lee Lucas could not have committed most, if not all, of the crimes he confessed to. The report detailed where Henry was when each murder was committed, and most of the time, he was nowhere near the crime scene. There was also clear evidence that several police departments, sheriff's departments, and the Texas Rangers deliberately fed information about the crimes to Henry. Henry would then use the information to create a confession, and then the investigators would close their murder cases. Both the newspaper article and the Lucas report said that there was evidence that on the day of and the day after Dianna Bryant was killed, Henry was 1,300 miles away in Jacksonville, Florida. So while the report made it clear that it seemed unlikely that Henry killed anyone other than his mother Viola, Becky Powell, and Kate Ridge, none of Henry's convictions were overturned. In 2006, it was the 25th anniversary of the murder of Dianna Bryant. The newspaper, the Brownfield News, was planning on publishing an article about the murder. But as the reporter who was writing the article reviewed the confession, he noticed several inconsistencies. He talked to a detective, and the detective said he became aware of the inconsistencies in the confession a few years earlier. The most notable problem was that Henry said he killed Dianna in the kitchen. However, Dianna was found dead in one of the bedrooms, and it was the only room that had been disturbed. Henry also said he had sex with Dianna, and then he redressed her. But there was no evidence that Dianna was undressed during the crime. In fact, when the police found her, her shirt was even tucked in. Also, Henry claimed that Becky, her brother Frank, and Otis searched the apartment for things to steal. But there were no signs of anyone rifling through the apartment. Another problem is that Dianna had been strangled from behind. When Henry confessed, he said he came at her from behind. But then, a few sentences later, he said she started to back away from him. If he was strangling her from behind, she would not have been able to back away. There was also a problem with the timeline. Henry said that he, Otis, Becky, and Frank had coffee at a restaurant that was kitty corner from the apartment. When they were done their coffee, they went directly to the apartment, they ate some food, and then Henry killed the young woman. Henry said that the murder happened between 10:30 and 11:30 p.m. The owner of the restaurant said that they have never been open later than 9 p.m. So that leaves Henry with at least 90 minutes unaccounted for. The owner of the restaurant does not think that Henry was ever in the restaurant. The owner also said she was sure that someone on her staff would have remembered two men like Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole with two teenagers coming into the restaurant and just ordering coffee around closing time on the same night a murder was committed 100 feet from the restaurant. These inconsistencies, along with the evidence that Henry was in Jacksonville on the day of and the day after the murder, cast serious doubt or even flat out proves that he didn't kill Dianna Bryant. In the article that marked the 25th anniversary of Dianna's death, it talks about the inconsistencies in Henry's confession and about the evidence that Henry wasn't even in the state of Texas at the time of the murder. After the story was published, the sheriff said he would consider reopening the case. Dianna's family were interviewed, and they all had different reactions to the possibility of the case being reopened. Dianna's father did not want the case reopened. He said the police caught Henry and he confessed. To him, the case was closed. Dianna's mother said she always doubted Henry's confession. She thought that Dianna had most likely been killed by someone she knew. Dianna's sister said she doesn't believe that Henry is the killer, and she wants to know who really murdered her sister. Unfortunately, there is no physical evidence from the case. Because there's no physical evidence, the case was not reopened. So unless someone comes forward with information, the case will remain closed, with Henry Lee Lucas being the official killer of Dianna Bryant. Number 1. Debra Jackson. On Halloween 1979, two men were driving west on an access road towards Interstate 35, about 5 miles north of Georgetown, Texas. As they got near the interstate, they saw something in a culvert beside the road. They parked their vehicle and got out to investigate. What they found was the nude body of a young woman. The only thing that was on the body was a pair of orange socks. The two men called the sheriff's department. The sheriff, Jim Boutwell, and several deputies came out to investigate. They did not find any forms of identification near the body. The police collected some items that were found near the body, but nothing they found helped them in identifying the woman. The medical examiner concluded that the woman had been sexually assaulted. The killer had strangled the woman to death with his bare hands. The medical examiner thought that she had been killed on the night of October 30th or the morning of October 31st. The sheriff's department determined that the killer parked along the side of Interstate 35. He dragged the body from his vehicle and threw it over the guardrail into the culvert. The sheriff's department had sketches of the woman drawn up and released to the public. But no one recognized the woman, so she remained unidentified. Because she was found only wearing orange socks, she was given the nickname Orange Socks. The sheriff's department had very little evidence to guide their investigation. Someone had seen a young woman who matched the description of Orange Socks hitchhiking in the area at around noon on the day before the body was found. The police suspected that Orange Socks was hitchhiking through the area and she was killed by someone who picked her up. They thought if the killer was traveling on the interstate, there was a good chance he wasn't local. He could have just been passing through the area. Interstate 35 runs all the way from Duluth, Minnesota to Laredo, Texas. This made the investigation even more difficult. The killer and the victim could have come from any number of places. If the killer did pick up the victim while she was hitchhiking, then the murder was random, and there was probably no connection between the victim and the killer. Or the victim may not have been hitchhiking at all, and she was killed by someone she knew. With so many unknowns, the case seemed like it was impossible to solve. The sheriff's department thought that the only way it would be solved was if someone confessed to the murder. 3.5 years later, in June 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was arrested for the weapons violation. In court, Henry told the judge he had killed over 100 women. After his court appearance, Henry started confessing to a Texas Ranger named Phil Ryan. When Henry confessed to a crime, Ryan would call the sheriff's department or the police department in that jurisdiction and pass along the information. Jim Boutwell was the sheriff of Williamson County, which is where the body of Orange Socks was found. Ryan let Boutwell know that Henry had confessed to a murder in his jurisdiction, so Boutwell had Henry transferred to the jail in Georgetown, which is in Williamson County. Sheriff Boutwell took over contacting other jurisdictions about Henry's confessions. Boutwell would often sit in when other people interviewed Henry, and he would accompany Henry to crime scenes. In the Netflix documentary series, The Confession Killer, Texas Ranger Phil Ryan says, He never saw Henry without Boutwell. Not long after being brought to the jail in Georgetown, Boutwell showed Lucas a photograph of Orange Socks. Henry said that he remembered her, but he didn't know her name. He claimed that he had picked her up in Oklahoma while she was hitchhiking. They made their way to Texas, and they were driving on Interstate 35. Henry asked her to have sex with him, and she said no. She then tried to jump out of the car, and he pulled her back in. They started fighting, so Henry pulled onto a deserted road. Using his hands, he strangled her to death and then had sex with her body. He then pulled her body out of the car and then dropped it into the culvert. This confession was videotaped. After Henry confessed, he was charged with the murder of the woman only known as Orange Socks. This time, Henry was looking at the death penalty if he was convicted. Before Henry went to trial, reporter Hugh Ainsworth began to investigate where Henry was on Halloween 1979 when Orange Socks was killed. She was killed about 8 months after Henry settled in Jacksonville, Florida. At the time, Henry was working for a roofing company. The company's bookkeeper had a record that showed that Henry was at work on the day Orange Socks was killed. Henry's foreman also said that he was at work that day. He had marked him present, and he had remembered working with him. The owner of a store in Jacksonville said that Henry had cashed a check at his store on the night before the murder. The owner even had the check with Henry's signature on it. Ainsworth went to Sheriff Boutwell with the evidence. Boutwell did not accept the evidence from Ainsworth, and he also cut off Ainsworth's access to Henry. So Ainsworth gave the evidence to Henry's defense team. Henry was confronted about the evidence that placed him over 1,000 miles away the day before and the day of the murder. Henry said that the records could easily be forged and they did not prove anything. He then said he had paid off people to tell the police he was at work on the day of the murder. Henry ended up confessing to the murder of Orange Socks 5 times. Henry's lawyer asked him why he was working so hard to sabotage his own defense. Henry explained that he wanted to die because he felt so bad about killing Becky Powell, the only woman he ever loved. But if he killed himself, he would never get into heaven with Becky. If the state were to kill him, then it wouldn't be suicide. In April 1984, Henry went to trial for the murder of the woman known only as Orange Socks. He had already been convicted of the murders of Becky Powell and Kate Ridge, and he had been given a life sentence and a 75-year sentence for the convictions. Henry's lawyer had his foreman, the bookkeeper from his company, and the store owner testify. They all said that Henry was over 1,000 miles away in Jacksonville at the time of the murder. Henry's work record from the day of the murder and the check he cashed on the day before the murder were both entered into evidence. The only evidence that the district attorney had was Henry's 5 confessions. The prosecutor played the videotape of Henry dismissing the evidence that proved his innocence as forgeries. Since that interview took place, Henry had retracted those statements. The prosecutor also played a videotape of one of Henry's confessions. But there were several problems with the video. Notably, Sheriff Boutwell tells Henry key details about the case. Boutwell testified, and he said he just did that to help refresh Henry's memory. Also, parts of the confession had been edited. The defense alleged that the parts that were cut out showed Bellwell coaching Henry on what to say. Bellwell denied this on the stand and said only unimportant footage was cut out for the sake of brevity. The prosecutor also argued that Henry could have driven to Georgetown, Texas, killed Orange Sox, and then driven back to Jacksonville in time for work. The defense argued that none of that made sense. Why would Henry drive 15 hours to an area that he's never been to and he has no connection to, just to murder a woman who was hitchhiking, only to turn around and go home so that he can be at work on time? Why not choose a more convenient victim? Or if he did pick her up somewhere else, why did he drive all the way to Georgetown to kill her, or at the very least dump her body there? The prosecutor argued that Henry's actions were strange, but he pointed out that Henry was no ordinary human being. After all, Henry had already been convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of his own mother. The prosecutor argued that Henry Lee Lucas was a predator who loved to kill. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Henry was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. 2 years later, the Dallas Times-Herald published the explosive article which alleged that Henry Lee Lucas could not have committed most, if not all, of the murders he confessed to. For their work, the authors of the article, Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Henderson, were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Journalism. The article was followed by a year-long investigation by the Attorney General. This resulted in the Lucas Report, which mapped out where Henry was around the times when the murders he confessed to were committed. In nearly every case, there was evidence that he was nowhere near the crime scene. This included the murders he had been convicted of, with the exception of Becky Powell and Kate Rich. However, neither the article nor the Attorney General's report did anything to change Henry's prison status. He remained on death row in the Huntsville prison for the murder of the woman known only as Orange Sox. He was scheduled to die via lethal injection on June 30th, 1998. As Henry's execution date drew closer, Henry was adamant that he did not kill the unidentified hitchhiker. People on Henry's behalf, including reporter Hugh Ainsworth and Henry's defense lawyer, were urging then-Governor George W. Bush to commute Henry's sentence to life in prison because he was innocent of the murder of Orange Sox. It was an upward battle for Henry to get his death sentence commuted. By far, Texas executes more inmates than any other state. Under Bush's governorship, executions happen on average every 9 days. More executions happened while he was governor than any other governor before him. Also, a Texas governor had not commuted a death sentence based on an inmate's claims of innocence since the 1930s. At the time, Bush was considered the frontrunner for the Republican presidential ticket, although he had yet to announce that he was running for president. Henry was not the most sympathetic candidate to get his sentence commuted. If Henry didn't kill Orange Sox, he had still been convicted of 10 other murders. His victims included his own mother. So commuting Henry's sentence was going to be politically risky for Bush, who would eventually announce that he was running for president. Then, on June 26, 1998, the State Board of Pardons and Parole voted 17-1 that Henry's sentence should be commuted to a lesser unspecified sentence. They did not believe Henry was innocent of the murder of Orange Sox, but they thought that there was enough doubt to justify a life sentence. The next day, which was 3 days before Henry was supposed to be executed, Governor Bush announced that he would commute Henry's death sentence to life in prison. Bush acknowledged that Henry had committed some horrible crimes, but he said there was strong evidence that Henry wasn't even in the state of Texas when Orange Sox was killed. Governor Bush said, "As a supporter of the death penalty for those who commit horrible crimes, I feel a special obligation to make sure the state of Texas never executes a person for a crime they may not have committed. I take this action so that all Texans can continue to trust the integrity and fairness of our criminal justice system." It was the only case during Bush's tenure as governor that he intervened and commuted a sentence. Henry Lee Lucas died in prison 3 years later in March 2001 at the age of 64. In July 2019, nearly 40 years after the murder, the Williamson County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit released a new and more realistic sketch of the woman known only as Orange Sox. A woman saw the sketch and thought it might be her long-lost sister. The woman got in contact with the sheriff's department and they got a sample of her DNA. It turned out that Orange Sox was the woman's long-lost sister, 23-year-old Debra Jackson of Abilene, Texas. She left her hometown in 1977 and lived in Amarillo for a bit, where she worked at a Ramada Inn. She then moved to Hazel, Texas, and worked at an assisted living facility. Just before Jackson was found dead, she had worked for an investment firm. Jackson's family had never reported her missing. Unfortunately, identifying Debra Jackson did not lead to any suspects in her murder. The most tragic part of Henry's false confessions is that he helped other people get away with murder. At the time, Debra Jackson's murder was not the only unsolved murder that happened in the latter part of the 1970s along Interstate 35 in and around Williamson County. On August 23, 1976, Lisa Haley was found murdered in a ditch just north of Waxahachie, Texas. Her friends last saw her alive 2 days earlier in Austin, Texas. Haley was from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and her friends said she was hitchhiking back home. She had been severely beaten in the head and stabbed in the neck with an awl. 2 years later, on the evening of November 5, 1978, 19-year-old Frank He and 18-year-old Rita Salazar went out for a date to see a movie in Austin. The couple did not return home that night. The car was found abandoned and out of gas. The next morning, He was found dead just north of Georgetown. He had been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber handgun. A short time later, Salazar was found near Waco, Texas. She had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber handgun. Henry Lee Lucas took credit for the double homicide, but no evidence ever connected him to the crime. The case against him was presented to the grand jury, but they rejected Henry's confession. As a result, Henry was not charged in connection with the double murder. On September 3, 1979, less than a year after the double murder, 27-year-old Sharon Schilling's body was found on a road in San Marcos, Texas. Her body was found just a few blocks from Interstate 35. She had been sexually assaulted and shot once in the stomach with a .410 gauge shotgun. Otis Toole claimed he was the one who killed her and he did it by himself, but he was never charged with the crime. A month later, on October 8, 1979, the body of a woman was found in a field beside Interstate 35. The victim had been stabbed 35 times. The body was identified as 34-year-old Sandra Dubbs. Dubbs had been driving from St. Louis, Missouri to San Antonio, Texas. She passed through Austin a few days earlier, on August 2nd, and then her car broke down just outside the city. It's suspected that she was kidnapped and killed after her car broke down. Henry Lee Lucas confessed to this murder as well. He said that he and Audis killed her together. But the day before the murder, Henry had worked and cashed a paycheck in Jacksonville, Florida, which is over 1,000 miles from where the body was found. Also, Audis' employer had a record of him working on the day of the murder. Just over 2 weeks later, married couple Molly and Harry Schlesinger, who were both 53, were working at the combination book and liquor store that they owned on Interstate 35 in Austin, Texas. At about 8:30 p.m. on October 23, 1979, the couple was shot to death in their store. Molly was shot once in the head, while Harry had been shot multiple times. The murder weapon was a .22 caliber handgun, which was never found. $250 was found in their cash box. The police suspected that the couple put up a fight with a robber. The robber shot them, and then he panicked, so he fled without the money. Henry confessed to these murders as well. He said that he and Audis committed the murder together. But records show that both Henry and Audis were at work in Jacksonville, Florida, the day before and the day after the murders. Henry also cashed a check the day before the murders, and he was issued a new paycheck the day after the murders. So neither he nor Audis were charged with the murders. Just over a week later, the body of Debra Jackson, aka Orange Socks, was found in a culvert just north of Georgetown. 8 months later, on June 23, 1980, 21-year-old Rodney Massey's dead body was found near Temple, Texas. He had been shot 4 times. About 2.5 weeks later, on July 9, 1980, the body of a woman was found near Pflugerville, Texas. She had been stabbed 27 times with a screwdriver. The woman has never been identified. The only description of the woman was that she was in her 20s, she might have been Hispanic, she had given birth, and she had good dentures. On June 4, 1981, 11 months after the body of the Jane Doe was found, the body of another young woman was found lying next to Interstate 35 near New Braunfels, Texas. She had been shot 6 times. It did not appear that she had been sexually assaulted. She did not have any identification on her. She was not identified until 28 years later, in 2009, through a DNA match. She was 18-year-old Carol DeLeon, who lived in San Antonio, Texas. She was last seen alive the night before her body was found. She had gone out to a club in San Antonio, which is about 35 miles away from where her body was found. Perhaps surprisingly, neither Henry nor Audis confessed to the last 3 murders. Unfortunately, since Henry and Audis were considered the suspects in many of the murders because Henry had confessed, the real killer or killers got away with murder. The family of Rita Salazar was confident that Henry Lee Lucas had killed her. Rita and her date, Frank He, were shot to death in November 1978. Rita's sister, Ninfa, became angry when Governor George W. Bush commuted Henry's death sentence to a life sentence. In 1999, as Bush started to make his run for president, Ninfa faxed media outlets newspaper articles that said that Bush had sided with a serial killer. Bush's team did not want Ninfa stirring up trouble, so they asked her what they could do to keep her quiet. She said she wanted the DNA from her sister's crime scene tested. She wanted to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Henry was guilty so they could be put back on the death row. Bush's team agreed to have the evidence tested. It turned out that the DNA found on Rita Salazar's underwear did not belong to either Henry Lee Lucas or Otis Toole, but a match to the DNA was not found. Then in November 2008, 30 years after the murder, the DNA was matched to an individual. The DNA belonged to 54-year-old Benny T. Arena Jr. A year earlier, in November 2007, T. Arena had been on parole for his third drinking and driving violation, but he did something to get his probation revoked, and he was sent to prison. When he was sent to prison, his DNA was collected. In February 2012, T. Arena pleaded guilty to the murders of Rita Salazar and Frank He, and he was given 2 40-year sentences. While the murder of Debra Jackson is considered solved, many people do not believe Henry Lee Lucas is the person who killed her. So the murders of Frank He and Rita Salazar are the only Interstate 35 murders that have genuinely been solved. Betty T. Arena has never been linked to any of the other murderers. It's not known if one person committed the rest of the murders or if they were committed by several different people. Unfortunately, because the police thought that Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were responsible for most of the murders, some cold-blooded killers, or a brutal serial killer, or even serial killers, got away with their crimes. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please check out criminallist.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/criminallylisted. But that is all for today. Thanks again for watching.